Hi, this is Thelma English. Welcome back to American Lit. We are at session 28 this week, and that is out of 31. How are you this week? I hope you had a good week. I did. Let's open with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we are so thankful for this day. We're thankful for the privilege of home education. We're thankful for every family represented here who has chosen the more difficult way of home education rather than choosing a public institution or even a series of workbooks. And I pray that you bless these families in Jesus' name. Amen. Let's continue. I didn't set my screens up as well this week, excuse me. Let's pause our video for the devotion for our volunteer reader for the Valley of Vision. Okay, we're back. Session 28. I know this is quite a screen full of information. Normally, when you build a PowerPoint, you really don't want to put more than 7 or 10 lines of text on a screen, and this is really overkill. Excuse me. Okay. You have your paper, Naturalism, in Steinbeck's Red Pony. Go ahead, get that turned in. Again, if it was okay with your teacher, parent, or facilitator, it was okay. If you did a series of comments, quotes, and comments on the quotes, or in an official paper format, kind of depends on your age and grade group and who's teaching the class. Then you have an open book quiz, completely open book, that you're going to explain realism and naturalism, romanticism, realism and naturalism. You can pick 1, 2, or 3 according to your teacher and how much time they want to take for this. Again, you are using your own materials, and this, of course, is in preparation for our final exam, where you'll need to explain this on paper. So we're getting you used to doing this now. We'll be looking at modernism in class. We'll be looking at the open boat, Stephen Crane's short story, The Open Boat, in class. We'll be talking a little bit about Marx, Freud, Nietzsche, with some cool quotes from them, and more Darwinian influence on American authors. And then I've added new this year, The Law of Life, Jack London. That is a 6-page, if you print it, 6-page short story by Jack London. It's in session 28 at Thelma's library. And you may or may not choose to print this, require it as reading, or leave it for your students to print if they like. It's an especially good naturalist short story. It is about an old aging Indian chief who is waiting while his tribe, his son is the chief now, and he's the old chief. His tribe is packing everything up and getting ready to go. And just before they leave him there to die, the son, the chief, comes over and says, all is well. And the old man says, all is well. And they've left him a little pile of sticks and a fire burning. And after they leave, he kind of wonders if anybody will come back, or if his son will come back and change his mind and take him with them again. And he wishes that his selfish granddaughter would have brought him a few more sticks to buy him a little more time. And he's expecting to freeze to death when his little fire is out. He keeps adding more sticks. And of course, at the end of the story, if you expect a dark turn around every corner, he's not so lucky to freeze to death. And that's how the story ends. So very much a naturalist story. You're familiar with that now after reading about Jody and his pony Gavilan, what naturalism really is, that every corner you turn in the plot, it gets a little darker and a little darker and a little darker. You're going to be reading from Great American Short Stories. My edition looks like this. I think yours is different now. And we'll be reading about a story from 1920, Bernice Bobs Her Hair. Now, of course, now you know what this is all about because you saw the PowerPoint last week. Then, and it's a cute story. Then we'll be reading Hemingway's The Killers, very much a naturalist story, only 8 pages. And that is in our Great American Short Stories. Then we'll be reading a London story, To Build a Fire, which is kind of like The Law of Life, a little bit longer with a little bit more interest. But again, the man has no name, the dog has no name, and it's all about trying to survive in the wilderness. Who is more fit to survive in that wilderness? Is it the man or is it the dog? And you can probably guess. Expect a naturalistic downturn at every corner that the plot turns. Then we'll be looking at Stephen Crane, War is Kind in Great American Poems. And War is Kind, we may as well open up Great American Poems now. This is on page 40, War is Kind. And of course, this is quite a sarcasm because war is not kind. And it's a very short poem. Stephen Crane, do not weep, maiden, for war is kind, because your lover threw wild hands toward the sky, and the affrighted steed ran on alone. So he threw his hands up in the sky, and the horse ran off without him. Do not weep, war is kind. And you can, that's on page 40, you can finish reading that in class at the end of today's lesson, or assign that to just be read on your own at home, according to whatever your teacher wants to read from Great American Poems. In our syllabus, we also have reading. You're reading Stephen Crane's Open Boat from 1897. This is really early naturalism, and this is a cool story. It's just terrible, but it's a cool story. It's on pages 233 to 241. Then in your syllabus, you'll be reading a Hemingway bio, a Jack London bio. Then you'll be reading a chapter from a really good book called 7 Men Who Rule the World from the Grave, called Biology is Destiny, and it's about Charles Darwin. And then you'll be reading an article from Christianity Today called Shouting Heresy in the Temple of Darwin, which is kind of cool. Let's go ahead and open our syllabus to Open Boat. The Open Boat on page 233 in your syllabus. It says the Open Boat, 1897. We don't have too many characters in this. We have the cook, the oiler, the correspondent. Don't get too attached to the oiler. The correspondent, the journalist, that is Stephen Crane, the guy who wrote the story. And it is based on his experience in an open boat. And then there's an injured captain. Don't get too attached to anybody in this story. So it's a tale intended to be after the fact, being the experience of 4 men sunk from the steamer Commodore. So it's a short story based on a real life event. And the American writer Stephen Crane was sailing in the steamer Commodore, which was running arms from Florida rebels resisting Spanish domination in Cuba. Crane was a war correspondent at the time. So a very early war correspondent. We still do that. We embed them in the military, and then they keep track of the war for us. Only now they do it in moving pictures. The Commodore sank, and Crane was cast adrift in an open boat with 3 or 4 crew members, including the captain. This is the dramatic story of his 30-hour experience. And then he talks, the first paragraph, he's going to mention the cook, and then he's going to mention the oiler, and he'll mention that the oiler is the strongest. And then you'll learn that the oiler does have a name in the second column. So this is page 233 in your syllabus. And in the second column, we see at the top the correspondent. Now that's Stephen Crane himself pulling at the oar. Then the injured captain is lying in the bow. And at the beginning of the second paragraph, we see that keep her a little more south, Billy, said the oiler. So that's the oiler is the only one who has a name. And let's see, then go down to the bottom, the last. Let's go 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, about a dozen lines up from the bottom, page 233 in the right-hand column. And the paragraph begins, in the wan light, the faces of the men must have been gray. Their eyes must have glinted in strange ways as they gazed steadily astern. Viewed from a balcony, the whole thing would doubtly have been weirdly picturesque. All right, viewed from a balcony. This is the narrator's way of telling us he doesn't care. He's indifferent. This is the detached narrator that we've been talking about in these short stories that show literary naturalism. Now turn to the next page, page 234 in your syllabus. And we're looking a little below the middle of the page, wherein the three were silent, save for a trifle of hemming and hawing. To express any particular optimism at this point, they felt to be childish and stupid. So they are simply accepting their circumstances. Nobody's being hopeful. Nobody has the attitude that the glass is half full. They all have the glass half empty. This is a pessimism because, of course, this is a pessimistic worldview. They expect everything to go bad. And let's see, I'm going through everything I have highlighted here for you. Let's progress to page 236, syllabus page 236. And in the first column, about 2/3 of the way down, we see it's 17 lines up. If I'm going to be drowned, if I'm going to be drowned, if I'm going to be drowned, why in the name of the seven mad gods who rule the sea was I allowed to come thus far and contemplate sand and trees? Was I brought here merely to have my nose dragged away as I was about to nibble the sacred cheese of life? It is preposterous. If this old ninny woman, fate, cannot do better than this, she should be deprived of the management of men's fortunes, as she's an old hen who knows not her intention. If she has decided to drown me, why didn't she do it in the beginning and save me all this trouble? The whole affair is absurd. Okay, these are great lines because this tells you the worldview of the story. If I'm going to be drowned, if I'm going to be drowned in the name of the seven mad gods who rule the sea, there are no seven mad gods who rule the sea. This just tells us that this is operating in a theological void. They're not calling out to God. They're not praying. They're not doing anything like that. Was he really just brought? They got really close and then they didn't make it in. Was he really brought this close just to nibble at the sacred cheese of life? Fate, this old ninny woman, fate. If she can't do better than this, so it's not even Mother Nature, it's not God, it's fate. An old ninny woman, she can't do better than this. She should be deprived of the management of men's fortunes. And then he says the whole affair is absurd. And that's where we see life is a cruel joke. The whole thing is absurd. Then let's progress to page 238. And here we have a bit of scariness. Na 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 na. All right, the bottom of page 238, the bottom of the second column, about 5 lines up. Nevertheless, it is true that he did not wish to be alone with the thing. Okay, they're taking turns watching out because they have to sleep. And so somebody has to stay awake to look in case anyone along the shore is seen so that they can try and get their attention. So he's alone. And he says it's true. He did not wish to be alone with the thing. And I'll tell you now, it's a shark. Okay, and they're just in a raft. And then he says again, let's turn to page 239, top of the page in the top of the left column. If I'm going to be drowned, if I'm going to be drowned, if I'm going to be drowned, why in the name of the seven mad gods who rule the sea was I allowed to come thus far and contemplate sand and seas? So he says it again. I suppose he's trying to be really cool here. When we get down to about line 14, actually it is line 14 in the left-hand column, syllabus page 239. When it occurs to a man that nature does not regard him as important, and that she feels she would not maim the universe by disposing of him, he at first wishes to throw bricks at the temple, and he hates deeply the fact that there are no bricks and no temples. Any visible expression of nature would surely be pelleted with his jeers. All right, what are we learning here? Nature doesn't regard him as important. Nature doesn't care about him. So nature is unfeeling. This is what we call his epiphany. This is his epiphany. He finally figures out, oh, nobody cares about me. I don't matter. Nature doesn't care about me. Nature is a god. She's indifferent. Remember the disconnected narrator, the unfeeling narrator? You can't even propitiate nature like you would a like the Greeks and the Romans did to pagan gods. You can't even say, I promise I'll be good, Neptune, if you let me go home. You can't do anything like that. So these guys are trapped in this boat. And the allegory would be just as we are trapped in life. And we don't have control over fate. We don't have control over what happens to us, and nobody cares. If you have a rather depressed worldview, you should stay away from these stories. All right, we see another reference. I'm still on syllabus page 239. And in the second-hand column, line 7 or 8, we see another reference to the thing. And by the bottom of the second column, near the bottom, they're actually calling it a shark. I just don't want you to miss that reading this late at night. Think it's boring and not realize there is a shark circling this boat. And so they talk about, now go to syllabus page 240. And in the middle of the first column, we see a reference to the serenity of nature and the struggles of the individual. Nature in the wind and nature in the vision of men. She did not seem cruel to him, nor beneficent, nor treacherous, nor wise, but she was indifferent. Okay, he's not a romantic where nature is wise and where you would go for wisdom and for advice and healing and all of that. Nature is indifferent, flatly indifferent. And there's an unconcern of the entire universe. A distinction between right and wrong seems absurdly clear to him. Then in this new ignorance of the grave edge, and he understands that if he were given another opportunity, he would mend his conduct and his words and be better and brighter during an introduction or a tea. He's thinking, I think I'd be another better person if I had more of a chance. And then in the second column, in syllabus page 240, they actually get capsized and all end up in the water. And it's January, we find out. So the water is absolutely freezing. 14 lines up from the bottom of the second column. The coldness of the water was sad. It was tragic. This fact was somehow mixed and confused with his opinion of his own situation, that it seemed almost a proper reason for tears. The water was cold. And the last page of this story, syllabus page 241, middle of the first column, between lines 35 and 40. He thought, I'm going to drown. Can it be possible? Can it be possible? Can it be possible? Perhaps an individual must consider his own death to be the final phenomena of nature. So death here is not viewed as sacred or a spiritual journey or anything, just a natural phenomena. It just happens. It's the last thing that happens to you is death. And in the second column, we see a little tiny piece of Christian imagery about 15 lines down, but a halo was about his head and he shone like a saint. This is after he's drug ashore the cook, waded toward the captain, but the captain waved him away. He was naked as a tree in winter, but a halo was about his head and he shone like a saint. He gave a strong pull and a lone drag and a bully heave at the correspondent's hand. The correspondent, schooled in the minor formula, said, "Thanks, old man." But suddenly the man cried, "What's that?" He pointed a swift finger and the correspondent said, "Go." In the shallows, face downward. And the strongest one out of all of them dies. But we see this the idea of human dignity shining. The person who is helping someone else kind of gets a halo around his head, and that would be for his dignity. And we read later in that paragraph, the second to the last paragraph, about the sinister hospitality of the grave. And when it came night, so they survive, or he survives. When it came night, the white waves paced to and fro in the moonlight, and the wind brought the sound of the great sea's voice to the men on shore. And they felt that they could then be interpreters. Now that they've actually fought with the sea, and some of them made it, they understand it. They understand the sea. So that's what the open boat is all about. I don't want to leave you confused before you read your story. And what else are we reading this week? To build a fire. Oh my goodness, this is the best thing you're going to read this week. Now, if you are kind of a naturalist, I'm sorry, I feel sorry for you. Open up your Great American Short Stories and go to page 157 for To Build a Fire. 157. And it says To Build a Fire. This story was written in 1908. And of course, it's by Jack London. And I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's very easy to understand. It's very similar to the law of life that I described to you in our session 28 schedule there at the top paragraph, the law of life, Jack London. It is posted in session 28 at the Thelma's Library website, and it's only six pages to print if you want to require that for reading, or if you just want to read it because it's kind of cool. I think these stories are cool. This is all about survival of the fittest. And this man who is in our story is a newbie. The man turned aside from the main Yukon Trail and climbed the high earth bank, and he's not looking. There's a clear day. It's much colder than he thought, and it's 70 miles to Dawson, and he's way far away from home. And then we read page 158 in the third line. He was a newcomer in the land, Chicago, and this was his first winter. The trouble with him was he was without imagination. He was quick and alert in the things of life, but only in the things, not in the significance. 50 degrees below zero meant 80 odd degrees of frost. Such fact impressed him as being cold and uncomfortable, and that was all. It didn't lead him to meditate upon his family as a creature of temperature and upon man's fragility in general, able only to live within certain narrow limits of heat and cold. And from there on, it did not lead him to the conjectural field of immortality and man's place in the universe. What's man's place in the universe? Remember, he's like an animal. And if you go out when it's really too cold, remember, it's colder. It's actually colder than 50 degrees below. Should he be out? He's in the Yukon. In the Yukon, instinct is far more crucial to survival than intelligence. He needs instinct. And does man have instinct? Now we read at the top of page 159, at his heels trots a dog, a big native husky. Okay, who do you think is going to have, I'm just going to spill it to you. Who do you think is going to have more survival instinct? The native husky dog or the newbie man? Yes, you're right. It's the dog. The dog, we even read in the fourth line, it knew that it was no time for traveling. Its instinct told it a truer tale than was told to the man by the man's judgment. And then they find out it's 75 below zero. But the brute had its instinct. And then, page 159, the last line on the page, he was not much given, now turn the page, to thinking. Page 160. And just then particularly had nothing to think about, save that he would eat lunch at the Forks, and at 6 o'clock he'd be in camp with the boys. There was nobody to talk to, and had there been, speech would have been impossible because of the ice muzzle on his mouth. So he continued monotonously to chew tobacco and to increase the length of his amber beard. So we're going to read in this story all about instinct. Page 161, we're going to see it's a matter of instinct again, and that the dog is just merely instinct. The whole thing about this story is that, let's see, middle of page 162, but the dog knew, all its ancestry knew, and it had inherited the knowledge, very much Darwinian science. There was no keen intimacy between the dog and the man. And another few lines down, it was not concerned, it being the dog. He has no name. It's not, Jack the dog or Bowser or anything like that. It was not concerned in the welfare of the man. It was for its own sake that it yearned back toward the fire. So this is all about naturalism. Life is a cruel joke. Just as the man is going to decide, oh my goodness, I outwitted nature, I made it, nature's going to get him. He barely gets the security of a fire. He knows he was able to build a fire once, and he thinks, oh good, I saved myself. And only a stupid person would travel alone. 75 degrees below zero. He's just not very smart. Page 167, if we go the 6th line down, the dog is thinking here for the story, page 167. And all he knows, the fire goes out. The fire provider had failed. And of course, it's going to get worse. We're going to find out that the chances are against him. This is the whole idea of luck or fate. That's what life is all about, fate and luck. And he starts to lose his battle with the frost. And then, of course, like every good naturalistic story, he's going to have an epiphany. Page 169 in Great American Short Stories. And we are a little more than halfway down the page. We read, he was losing his battle with the frost. Go down a few lines. He sat up and entertained in his mind the conception of meeting death with dignity. That's his epiphany. And in a naturalistic story, there will always be this epiphany. Oh my goodness, I'm going to die. Well, I'm going to die well. I'm going to die with dignity. And he decides he's bound to freeze anyway. He may as well take it decently. And then what do you think? Is he going to make it? Okay, so this plot has a very narrow focus. It only covers a few hours. First, the focus is he wants to reach the camp. And then his next focus is just narrowed to just warding off frostbite. He just wants to not get frostbite and lose fingers or toes. And then the focus narrows even more as he gets in more and more trouble to just simply surviving. And then the focus narrows when he realizes he's not going to make it there to dying with dignity. And this is classic naturalism. Classic naturalism. Do I spoil it for you? Okay, so you've got reading from our book, from our poetry book, from your syllabus, interesting reading, and your writing is a mini assignment due next week. Explain the naturalistic elements of one of the short stories by Hemingway or London. And of course, you have a very short word minimum, 100 to 200 words, with quotes from the text. Grades 7, 8, 2 quotes, grades 9, 10, 3 quotes, grades 11, 12, 4 quotes, and it has to be from the text of the story. So also use syllabus pages 289, 315, and then the worldview charts on 362 to 68, and your charts for elements of naturalism, and that's due next week. So you can quote from your charts. It's up to your teacher whether the quotes count as a word count. I like you to use some of your own words to describe this. Or the alternate assignment would be to contrast theistic literary elements with realist or naturalist. And then also you need to have text quotes. And the third alternative, which is not written down here, that only a few students usually take advantage of. Most classes have one person that just loves to write stories. If you would prefer, you could write a naturalist short story. Of course, that's going to be a lot more words and it's going to take more time, but some of you just simply think that would be more fun. And that means you're going to write a short story about man against fate or the elements, and every corner of the plot where we would look for hope, we're going to see despair and destruction, and it has to have a really sad ending where they all die. It's a very narrow plot. So it wouldn't take place over more than a day or a day and a half at the most. Most naturalistic stories just take place over one day. They're a short story to make you focus on how fate doesn't care about you. Okay, those are your assignments. Moving on. We'll stop for about 5 minutes for this. What is realism? And another 5 minutes for what is naturalism. And use your syllabus. By now, this should be pretty quick for you. Okay, we're going to get started again. That wasn't too bad, was it? Realism. Okay, realism is just not as bad as naturalism, right? So like all literary movements, the lines between early romanticism and realism are impossible to draw. You know, Stephen Crane is an early naturalist when most people are still writing with realism. Realism merges into romantic literature to educate the reading audience. So we have realism. And then when we get to naturalism, we've got this objective, neutral narrator. These are all terms, by the way, that you can use in your papers to impress us. The objective, neutral narrator who doesn't really care. The narrator doesn't present the morals as right or wrong, right? Because we're operating in a theological void. So these stories are amoral. There's not a right thing to do and a bad thing to do. It's just what happens. The detached narrator, he just tells the facts of the story, like if he was watching from the balcony, as I just read to you in The Open Boat. Social Darwinism is going to be there. It's just going to be there. And you could see that in the story To Build a Fire, that the man was not as fit as the dog. He's just not as fit to survive. He didn't have the instinct, the correct instinct. So it's going to be, we'll see literature filled with characters who function on animalistic instinct, and they survive because of superior breeding. The dog will survive because he's bred for that type of weather, that type of cold, and the weaker characters just die. If you've ever read Call of the Wild, the nice guy dies. The weaker person always dies. It's the strong, ruthless character who's going to survive. That's Darwinian, where the survival of the fittest takes place in action in our story characters. And when the strong characters die, they choose how to die. You know, the weaker people die like weaklings and cowards and all that. But when strong characters die, they get to choose how to die, and they die nobly with some dignity, and they just face the elements that cause their demise. They just figure this is the next step. Social Darwinists tended to focus their arguments on the poor and the infirm. So we see in To Build a Fire, this guy was just not ready, where the struggle of the species was most evident. So you've got survival of the fittest. If you're the fittest, you get to survive. If you're not, you don't. So expect to read stories about the poor and the struggling. So I don't find them as interesting, but some people are really fascinated by this. Expect to see scathing appraisals of society, especially Western society and its institutions, things like family and the church. All aspects of society and propriety are going to be challenged because even family, even marriage and family, what happens in the wilderness, animals, the strongest animal gets the female that he wants. And if you apply that to people, it starts getting disgusting really quick. So institutions like traditional marriage and family are going to be questioned and found wanting. They just won't measure up. We're going to see there's no moral judgments because it's amoral. It's not immoral. It's not moral. It is amoral. It's a theological void. Frank and brutal descriptions. Often, usually, in fact, it will be man versus nature. The characters function by instinct, like an animal. We see strong, neurotic characters, and we have that objective, neutral narrator. He just tells it as it is, as though watching from a balcony. And the idea is that life is a cruel joke. You never know when it's your last day, but die well. We see social Darwinism, crude, vulgar descriptions, this heroic struggle to survive, which becomes the purpose of man, to struggle well, meeting death with dignity, just giving up. Don't fight it as you go out. And it is a theological void, the absence of God, and there are no more literary heroes. So the plots are developed to require the use of instincts, and that's why London has many of his set up in the Yukon. And the idea that life is a cruel joke. So what do we see? We expect to focus on literary character instead of on plot. In realism, we often have subplots, and the plot can go on for days, if not even years. In good realism, especially Christian realism, can go on for a long time. Complicated plots, complicated characters, complicated settings, all of that. So in realism and naturalism, especially late realism, early naturalism, we see the loss of the literary hero. There's nobody bigger than life to imitate. There's nobody worthy of imitation. For example, in a Jack London story, in the To Build a Fire, or in The Open Boat, there's no literary hero, somebody that you would imitate. Naturalism, what does it not like? Doesn't like sentimental fiction, where it all works out in the end. Doesn't like idealistic fiction. Doesn't like functioning family, because a strong man is the primary character. And it doesn't like strong marriages because a strong man who gets the best woman and may move on from one woman to the other, may beat up his woman if she doesn't, do right. Things like obedient children. No, you want a rough, tough child who's going to have good instincts, and happy endings. They don't like happy endings. Why? Because life is short and then you die. And when you move into naturalism, life is a cruel joke. So Maggie, A Girl of the Streets, not recommended reading, but you'll read about it in your syllabus. And The Red Badge of Courage, where we have no morality, where our soldier, Billy, it does not feel compelled to tell the truth. Naturalism, we expect to see a rejection of moral absolutes and a rejection of Christianity. God is absent from the plots. The plots exist as though there is no God. In fact, plots exist where there isn't even a church. Maybe you're up in the Yukon, you're in this town, there's not even a Christian in the town that the character could turn to for help, because that would be the character getting help. So expect an exploration and a challenge of Christian ethics and values. Each person gets to decide what is good for them. Naturalism in children's story. Naturalism literature, I've heard it called the cosmic chill. That's not my phrase, but I've heard naturalism called the cosmic chill. The world is out to get you, freeze you if it can, get you. Do we ever see naturalism in children's stories? We do, but they're not very nice stories. Some of the early fairy tales, the children got killed, and you have to think, okay, what is the moral lesson there for children? Naturalism may trivialize or profane things you hold to be sacred. Things like marriage, family, children's roles, clergy, church, purity, respect, trust, forgiveness. Naturalism, brutality can breed helplessness and despair in children and in teens. It's not good literature to read because it leaves you in a dark place in your mind. We know that realism in stories can teach, whereas anthropomorphism in stories has to be explained to have teaching value. And that's where, when you read a story, even like the Chronicles of Narnia, the seven books by C.S. Lewis, they are great allegories, but without someone explaining to you that anthropomorphism, where you have animals who are representing people, can be lost on children. Most of that must be explained to children. Whereas if you have good literature where the people are people, and I'm not anything against the Chronicles of Narnia, my boys and I read those through at least 7 times, the entire series of 7 books. They're excellent, but they were old enough to understand allegory and what anthropomorphism was, when you make the animals talk and the beavers talk and and Aslan is a lion who talks and he's the good one who can't be killed and all that. Little children don't understand that type of thing in literature. Little children understand morality best, and there is more teaching value in a story that has little children in it. They disobey and get in trouble. That's easier for children. If you're looking to teach children good things, that's what the studies show. They do better with real children in stories than with anthropomorphism. Realism and Christianity get along very well. Some Christian writers adopt realism. They have more bad things happen in the story than they maybe want to put there because they want it to be realistic. This is a photo of Randy Alcorn and his wife, Nancy, who just passed away last year this is photos from his website. I was privileged to take a class about heaven from Randy Alcorn when I was at Western Seminary here in Portland. He's a very, very good teacher, and I enjoy his books. So authors who include realism would be Harriet Beecher Stowe. It is a classic, great blend of realism and Christianity, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And then Frank Peretti. If you have not seen those books, they're old. They're about 30 years old now. But he wrote a series called This Present Darkness. And then the next one is called Piercing the Darkness. And they are amazing if you like sci-fi kind of stuff. But this sci-fi, these are angels. And then Randy Alcorn wrote a book similar that is called Deadline. He has several out that are like that. He also has a book about China, but I can't remember the title, that is incredible. That is realism plus all the good things about Christianity and all the good romantic things where you have this woman who is killed and she goes to heaven and she actually meets the man who killed her. He got saved because of her. And of course, you know, she forgives him and they have this reunion in heaven. And it's really pretty cool. So realism can change behaviors by modeling effects and consequences and make it seem a bit more like it could happen to you. There is overlap here. Notice that. Realism basically from the Civil War until just before World War I. Naturalism doesn't pick up World War I. This is also just after the Civil War and then through the beginning of World War I. It depends on the writer, how they choose to write their story. Now, shifting world views, talking about naturalism. And again, I like this Devil's Dictionary definition of realism and naturalism. It's the art of depicting nature as it's seen by toads, the charm suffusing a landscape painted by a mole or a story written by a measuring worm. And so this is the abstract narrator who doesn't even care. Now, what have we seen in naturalistic literature? These authors, Crane, Hemingway, Melville, London, they create this tension between the individual and the social constraints, all the things that are grounded in the Bible, the things that say you shall not. We've seen a rejection of moral absolutes, but where do moral absolutes come from? Of course, they come from the Bible, and we keep looking at Hebrews 4:12. For the word of God is living and active. It's living. It's still alive. Sharper than any double-edged sword. It penetrates even to dividing soul and spirit, joints and marrow. It judges the thoughts and attitudes of the heart. So when we're reading the Bible, it's judging us. And it either makes us feel guilty so that we will repent and quit doing what we're doing, or it will make us feel good and encourage us to do more good things. Literary heroes and anti-heroes. Literary heroes are no longer moral paragons in naturalist literature, subject to this universal standard where they're worthy of imitation and Christ-like. The anti-hero then develops in literature, and you'll hear that talked about in movies. It's an anti-hero where the bad guy is the main character of a story or a movie, and that explores individual experience and challenges traditional concepts of morality. That most movies nowadays have anti-heroes. The heroes are not good guys who are morally good. They are anti-heroes. Now, talking about history, we looked at all this last week. I want to review it really quick. What happened in that era where stories changed? Well, radio to begin with. 1922, we had radio and television available in families. 1930, only 200 sets. And by 1950, 50 million. When I was born in 1957, I don't know if we had a TV when I was born, but by the time I was a little girl, we had a TV, black and white, but it was a little TV, but we all had TVs. And so I call 1950s, is that the decade of conformity? Is that when everybody started conforming to popular media? Is that when media took over our lives and media started telling us what was good, what was bad, and media, whatever we saw on the TV, that's what we thought American morality should be like? Think about it. Silent movies, and then talkies, and then color by 1960. And in our structured notes, we left off modernism in American literature. And of course, this is from 1914 to 1945, so from World War I to World War II. And I mentioned Gertrude Stein had coined that phrase, the lost generation. In fact, she said, all you people who served in the war, you're a lost generation. You have no respect for anything. You drink yourselves to death. I think we could even say that today. Despite their gay look and the prosperity, the youth were called the lost generation. They didn't know what to do. They were lost. They came back from war, and what had happened? Everybody had moved from the farms. They came back, and what were they going to do? Go get a job and be like Bartleby and sit at a desk all day and do something. There were no more stable traditional values. There was an individual loss of identity coming back from the war. There was no supportive family life because everybody had their own job and went to work. There was no familiar small town community, no more barn raisings. Churches became kind of a thing of the past because the city churches just didn't meet the needs of these people who were used to a small town community where the pastor knew everybody. And so, and the life no longer revolved around planting and harvesting activities where you helped your neighbors and they helped you and you all helped one another. Everything was undermined by World War I and its aftermath. The idea that the entire world had gone to war and that people had enemies and hated each other. There ain't no answer. There ain't gonna be any answer. There never has been an answer. That's the answer. It's a sad worldview. The Roaring Twenties. We threw ourselves into the Roaring Twenties, or what's called the Jazz Age. Women's fashion, think about it, from 1890 to 1920, in just the course of 30 years. On the left, you have William and Mary. These are my great-grandparents. I remember my great-grandma and my great-grandpa, but look at, I don't remember them when they were young like this. I remember them when they were very old. But look at her dress. This is typical what you think of the late 1800s. And then look at her granddaughter in 1920. This isn't actually her granddaughter, but I have a picture somewhere of my grandma wearing a coat like this with a little hat, but I could not find that one for you. But this is what every woman wanted to look like in 1920. They all bobbed their hair. Obviously, their dresses are above their knees, and they're wearing heels that could be modern shoes, and they all have fur. A fur collar was the thing to have, kind of a sign of wealth. Amazing. And imagine what the grandma thought about the granddaughter who now looked like this. Granddaughter who's just 30 years younger than she is. My granddaughter is 40 years younger than I am. And from the 1920s to the 1930s, I showed you this one last week. This is Wilma and Thelma, my grandma and her sister, at the beach, just acting silly in the 1920s when they were late teenagers. But no one 30 years earlier in the 1890s no woman could have ever hoped to get away with dressing like that and going to the beach. And then you look just a few years ahead. Then here is my grandma with her husband, Charles, the guy with the big hair. Remember him from the pictures last week in the cars? He's the guy with the awesome hair. It's pretty much uncontrolled, I think. His hair was just uncontrollable. It just stood up and was fuzzy. And this is my grandma Thelma and her husband, Charles. This is in the 1930s. That's my mom in the lower left, little Mary Jane. But this is what life was like in the 1930s. And believe it or not, that house was thought to be a nice looking house. We have different standards now, don't we? We've really raised our standards. And then this is her sister, Wilma, who was playing around in the water with her. This is she and her husband getting married in 1936. Look how fashion changed. Look what she's wearing. It looks almost like a modern outfit. Amazing, isn't it? And then I showed you this of my grandpa's oldest brother, the one with the little X on his chest there. He's the one who fought in World War I. He was unlucky enough, Dwight was, to be, my grandpa wasn't born until I think 1902. So World War I, 1914, he would have only been 12, but his older brother was old enough to go to war. So people come home after the war completely permanently changed. I don't know if my Uncle Dwight did. He was such a nice person, and I'm pretty sure he was a Christian. I have his journal, which is really cool. If you have any grandparents or great grandparents or great uncles that wrote journals, oh my goodness, read those. It opens a complete new world for you to realize that their grammar was poor and they were thought well educated. They spoke differently. They talked differently. They were who they were. Clothes were different and houses were different and styles and how often you took a bath. All those things were different. They're just different. They're not worse or better. It's just the way it was before electricity and all that. But Americans returning home, they could never get that innocence back. These guys had been to war. They had killed people. They'd been trained to call them names so that they could kill people more easily. Western youths came home. They weren't ready to go out and work on the farm. They were rebelling. They were angry, disillusioned. Gertrude Stein was right. They were lost. Morality, anti-tradition. Modern literature, the morality of modern literature is anti-tradition. Whatever our parents said, that's what we're not going to do. So it's a search for personal freedom and new interests, and they throw aside those Christian values. And so we call it anti-tradition because the traditional values are Christian values. The most popular dance was Charleston, a wild dance, a type of moral abandonment instead of a stately waltz. You know, they're clicking their feet together. You could look up Charleston on YouTube and see they put their toes together and then they put their heels together and they're kind of sliding around. It's really I did that in a play one time. I danced Charlton. It's really a fun, high energy dance. So, but it kind of symbolized the behavior of a lot of Americans. And what are Americans doing? They're pursuing pleasure and wealth, and that pleasure and wealth is coming. T.S. Eliot wrote a long poem in 1922 called The Wasteland. He was born in America and then became a British citizen. So we talk about him in American Lit and Brit Lit. But this long poem talks about Western civilization like it's a bleak desperate, and it's in desperate need of rain, which would be allegorized as spiritual renewal. He makes a parody of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales when he opens his poem saying, "April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain." Chaucer's Canterbury Tales opens up talking about April. Most poets talk about April as the fun month of the year, the nice month of the year, because before roads, a road system, which is going to be 1930s and 40s, so all the hundreds of years before that, road systems were dirt roads. And so during the winter, people couldn't even really travel because the roads were all muddy and almost impassable unless you were really desperate. And when it got to be a little nicer out, the roads would dry up and you could take a carriage or ride a horse or something. And so a lot of poetry talks about April being the time of love. And he's really parodying Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. He's got some Latin up here as part of the poem, and then he's got some Greek out of the poem. And what it says in English, "I've seen with my own eyes the Cumaean Sibyl." She's right on the Sistine Chapel here, hanging in a jar. And when the boys asked her, "What do you want?" she answered, "I want to die." Really sad. The Sistine Chapel, she looks better than this now. I know she looks like a guy, but it's a girl. And Cumae, I've been there. That's classical lit. That's another class. But the Sistine Chapel has been cleaned. And so it actually looks better than this now. But you can't take pictures in there. You have to settle for what you can find on the internet. Eliot was a poet. He was a dramatist. He was a literary critic. He got the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1948. And he wrote the poems, The Love Song of Alfred Prufrock and The Wasteland and The Hollow Men. Oh, wow. Look up The Hollow Men. T.S. Eliot. It's such a good poem and it's short. And then the play Murder in the Cathedral, which is about Thomas à Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, but that's Brit Lit. It's a play about murder in the cathedral. And if you did Brit Lit, then you know about Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Eliot was born, I told you all this. He moved to the UK in 1914, and then he became a British citizen later. So he claims The Wasteland was an emptying of his brain. He says it wasn't anything special. I just emptied out my brain and that's what came out. But the world has hailed that poem as one of the most important works of the 20th century because it has, remember, what's modernism? Fragmented voices, fragmented structure, allusions that kind of make it fit into the modern category really well. The First World War, what happened to church? Everybody quit going to church. It had an impact on people's beliefs and their values. A lot of people became disillusioned with traditional values, which means Christian values, and institutions, including church. The church was seen as basically ineffective in preventing the horrors of war, right? The church wasn't able to prevent war. And there's a theological misunderstanding of sin. People don't realize that when you sin, you have to repent and you get forgiven, but that we are born sinners. They don't understand that. And that leaves them feeling void and empty, like they think God should have step down and not let World War I happen. Whereas men have free will. They didn't understand those things because they weren't being taught. Scientific discoveries and machines provide a lot of security to people, more they thought than what the preachers could provide. So church attendance goes way, way down. This is an article from 1920. The church is on decline. Of the 110,000, or is that 110 million people in the United States, only 40 million go to any church. Boy, I wish there were 40. I wish there was that percentage, 35% going now. There are 3 million fewer children attending Sunday schools than before the war. Of the total number of pastors before the war, 20% have resigned to enter other occupations. 1 out of 5. Such were the statements made by Reverend Newton in New York. He recently resigned the pastorate of the City Temple in London to return to America. This is just really, really sad. Pastors left, people left the church. It was a social upheaval, and the social upheaval brought by, I wrote World War II, and of course it should say World War I, excuse me, left many exchanging church socials for more exciting entertainment. There were a lot of high-profile religious scandals. Amy Semple McPherson, that eroded people's trust in the churches and faith leaders. And so it declined really fast. Now think about poor Bartleby. I know you just love that story and you wish I had 5 more like that for you to read, but it just dehumanized Bartleby, didn't it? His job. He's not an individual, he's just a human copy machine. And of course, the theme would be something like the loss of individuality. He's not even a person anymore, is he? This is a great book cover because it has those bricks, his window looking out at bricks. And the idea was that Melville's trying to tell us how stultifying that Wall Street world was for people like Bartleby. He just makes mechanical copies. He doesn't get to think of things on his own or work in fresh air and enjoy the fresh air and animals and the weather. He doesn't even know what the weather's like outside. And this is, again, moving from the farms to the cities, what happened to some individuals. In fact, the lawyer is initially attracted to Bartleby because he doesn't have much of a personality. And the lawyer thinks, he'll be a good employee. He doesn't care. He'll just sit there and make copies all day. And their office is on Wall Street. This picture is incorrect, isn't it? Because it shows a window looking into another building, but there's bright light. And I think for it to be effective, it needs to be really dull looking with just the bricks. Bartleby just stares out. He's really a victim of wage slavery. He has to work to pay for his keep, but the work has ruined him. He's not even a human being anymore. So the tone is really nihilistic, wasn't it? Reflecting Bartleby's isolation and despair. While the religious readings of Bartleby seem to be on the wane, I want you to know there's at least 2 critics that try to make cases. This is absolutely ridiculous. There's nothing behind this, but there's always somebody trying to do something new with Bartleby. There's a guy in 1970 who argued that the uncompromising clerk, Bartleby, is not just a Christ-like figure, but he's Jesus. Bartleby represents a Christ-type figure, or that he's a literary Christ-type, because I don't know why, because you tell me it's a ridiculous idea. And then there's another guy in 1972 who argued that no, Bartleby is not a Christ type. He's God. Bartleby is God. So these people have a really low opinion of Christ or God. So the lawyer's rejection is a metaphor of the rejection of genuine spirituality. Really some sad commentary. Now, going back to our history in our structured notes, now your next category is the New Deal. The New Deal, and you've studied this in your American history textbook, if you've studied your American history textbook alongside with American literature. This is set up by FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, so FDR. The Social Security Act of 1933, this is a huge big deal. 1935, huge big deal, the Social Security Act. You don't want the grandmas and grandpas starving to death. So they set up Social Security, and it sounded really good. But in 1945 and 1965, Between then, 20 years, the decline in worker to beneficiary ratio went from 41 workers for every person collecting Social Security to 4 workers per person collecting Social Security. So Social Security right away by 1965, and what's the thing that happens in the 60s? A free and easy to obtain birth control. It's the sexual revolution. Birth control ushers in the sexual revolution. All of a sudden, we have disconnected. We've disconnected physical intimacy with childbearing, because prior to the 60s, if you were sexually active, you were going to get pregnant. And after the birth control pill, and you have this sexual revolution that says you can just now go couple up with anybody you want as often as you want. You don't have to have babies. You don't have to get married and just start having babies. And this was huge. Women thought that this was a freedom for them, that they didn't just have to have kids. They didn't have, if they were sexually active, they didn't just have to start having babies. The problem was this disconnected the fathers from the children too. The fathers could just say, well, now we can be physically intimate with whoever we want to, and as long as they take the pill, nobody will get pregnant. And so they end up going from woman to woman to woman. So it was supposed to be a freedom for women, and it ends up devaluing women and cheapening women, to where now it seems to be the regular thing that if you're dating somebody, you're also sleeping with them, which of course is extremely demeaning to women. And women do still get accidentally pregnant. And then guys just say, well, that was your fault. You got pregnant. I'm not responsible. Go get an abortion. And now it's all completely up to the woman, whether she keeps the child or not. If she keeps the child, she's on her own. And if she doesn't want to keep the child, then she has to have an abortion. So the sexual revolution after the 60s and during the 60s was just horrific on American society. And of course, you're all born in the last 15 or 20 years. And so you have to study history. The Social Security program matured in the 1960s when Americans were consistently having fewer children. They were starting to live longer. They were earning wages at a slower rate than the growth in the number of retirees. I look this up every year when I do it. Last time I looked up was 2022. As these trends have continued, today there are just 2.7 workers per retiree. And you have an optional handout. This week, it's in session 28. If your teacher didn't print it, you can go to Thelma's library, go to session 28, and you can print that document about the decline of the birth rate, because we now in 2023, I think we're 1.9. We have fallen below replacement here in America too. I don't know if we're still getting saved by immigration or not, but a year ago, there were 2.7 workers per retiree, and it's expected to drop to 2.3, and it's dropped faster than that. The program was stable when there were more than 3 workers per beneficiary. But think about it, future projections, they think the ratio is going to continue to fall from 2 workers to 1. So you have 1 worker working and putting into Social Security for every single person trying to draw Social Security. And of course, that is unsupportable. You can't do that. And that's why they are pointing at 2035. Some say earlier, some say later. Depends on whether you're skeptical or think America will figure something out. That's why the Social Security system is, that's why they say don't depend on that. You need to also have your 401k, because Social Security might not be there for you. So then comes World War II. Now we have another war, bigger machines, more people dead. What did we do? We really didn't want to get into this war, did we? If you read your American history, we didn't want to get into this war. We ignored the invasions by Japan. I'm not talking Pearl Harbor, but the Japanese attacking other places. We ignored Germany, we ignored Italy, until Great Britain and France declared war on Germany in 1939. In 1939, Germany met Adolf Hitler. So we're getting very serious here. We shipped weapons and money. We tried to stay out of the war. Italy and Japan got more aggressive. The things the Japanese did, for example, to the Filipinos, oh my goodness, something where they were just horrible. It's horrible as they expanded their war fronts. And of course, Japan is an honor culture. And so everything's all about honor. And that's why they're willing to die in their airplanes, crashing them on ships. They're willing to die because it's all about an honor culture. So it's all about the way you die too. Then Pearl Harbor happened, December 7, 1941. You should just have that date memorized. And that's when we went into shock. We couldn't believe that happened. And then we just jumped into action and entered the war. And of course, America changed the course of history. So the cost of the war was $300 billion by 1945. That sound like a lot of money? That's nothing. When the war ended, 22 million were dead, 34 million were wounded. And after the war, we poured money into Germany and Japan. They had been our enemies, and now both are very important allies. Looks like a double slide there. What happened after the war? We see this social revolution. So as the war went on, World War II, women entered the workforce, and so families started having double incomes, or some of them, if their husband was at war, they still had pay, they had double income. And once you start living on double income or 2 cars, things like that, yeah, they stay in the workforce. They don't go back home again. Civil rights groups form to protect minority groups from oppression. And minority groups have now learned to band together, to become powerful. We keep wondering, well, how does that LGBTQ plus, how does that movement, if they're, half of 1% of the population, depending on who's arguing, how can they have so much power over the entire country? Well, it's because every minority group has gathered together. So groups that you consider a minority group would be non-Caucasian people, so Blacks and other ethnic groups. And then you would have women are considered minority, so all the female groups, and then you glom them also onto the LGBTQ plus, and all of a sudden you have a very powerful voice. And that's what happens. The minority groups have all banded together, and that gives them a more powerful voice so that they can do the things they want. But that makes it really hard for anybody in the group to be different from what the group believes. So if there's a woman who doesn't believe in some of the things the women's groups are pushing, that makes it really hard. Or if you have Black people who argue against some of the things that the Black groups are doing, then that makes it very hard for them. They don't fit in, and of course they are scandalized and chased down. So we see this moral revolution because we were powerful. We came out of that war the most powerful, and we kind of had this revolution of the feeling of power and the feeling of autonomy. We didn't need anybody, so we didn't need God. If you're an American, who needs God if you're an American? That's for, poor people starving. It kind of seemed like man could control the world, and man could make peace happen. Man could make peace happen. We would just go do it. We'd be the police of the war of the world. But man found out not only could he not control the world, he couldn't even control himself. And man was certainly impotent to maintain world peace. There was the Korean War, then there was the Vietnam War, then there's the war in Afghanistan. There has always been war on the face of the planet. The romantic idealism and optimism in literature starts getting cynical and pessimistic. And that's very much what modern literature is, cynical and pessimistic. Darwin's Origin of Species didn't help. The formulation of his thoughts on evolution claimed to give scientific support to the theory of man as a higher animal form, but we kind of found out, man, if we're a higher animal, we weren't much higher, were we? We couldn't even not go to war and kill each other. And think about it, if there was any human being before Adam, then there was sin and there was death before Adam. If there's no fall of man, if there's no original sin, then if there's no fall of man, no original sin, then there's no original sin, as we teach in theology. Excuse me. And if there's no fall, if there's no original sin, no fall from grace, then there's no need for a savior or redemption. And then Christ died for nothing. All of theology falls apart. Amazing, isn't it? This is a great magazine. It's called, this is from a book, Thinking Christianly. let's see, volume 2, number 29. So that's from a magazine, The Crimson Thread, From Darwin to Dachau by Regis Nichol. He's a worldview thinker. You can look him up on the internet and read. He has lots of good articles about all types of things, worldview. A person committed to Darwinism considers everything from lungs and vertebrae to intelligence and religious inclination as products of materialistic processes. So love is in your heart, a feeling of love, and emotion is just different neurons doing different things in your mind. For him, moral truth is not a universal standard of transcendent origin. It's a set of ethical preferences that are defined by the dominant culture. And what if you're not part of that dominant culture? Excuse me. In the end, morality for the Darwinist is basically whatever the ruling class says it is, whatever they say is good. If there's no immortality, if you're not alive forever, if you're just an organic human who's going to be inorganic and there's no soul that lives on, then there's no fellowship with God. And this is where theology started really suffering, and the theologians started splitting between the Darwinist theologians trying to make Darwin work because they thought it was inevitable that Darwin would take over, and they thought they had to make that work, and those who stuck with traditional theology, who of course are in the minority. So conservative theology is the remnant. Modernist theology embraced the science that seemed to be overwhelmingly true, that otherwise would threaten traditional theology into extinction. And so we see cults arising, excuse me, and expanding. Now, of course, there are a million problems, that's kind of a pun, with Darwinism, but just one of those is the supremacy of the Caucasian male, right? So we begin with racism, and then we get to genocide. We want to get rid of anybody who's not Caucasian, and communism, where you take over the smarter people, take over the not so smart people, and we get into abortion, genocide, homosexuality, female inferiority, and then promiscuity are resultant. Think about male promiscuity. If guys, guys have testosterone, so they're aggressive. We just chalk it up to evolution. Why do guys go after the prettiest girl, and then why do they cast somebody away to go for the next prettiest girl? We just chalk that up to evolution, and it excuses all the selfish male behavior. Males will be disloyal in that type of view. So aberrant or animalistic behaviors get justified. And this is where we get to barnyard morality. I call barnyard morality where people just go around doing whatever they feel like. And the idea that Darwin taught that females have smaller brains. So women fall off this chart. So children, women, and the senile white man have the intellect of an adult Negro per science textbooks in the 1860s, right after Darwin. That's just what Darwin did. And of course, this just invites slavery and abuse of Negroes, of anybody who's not Caucasian, and of women. The idea that they have smaller brains. Darwin said there would never be a female who would write a science textbook or excel in science or anything like that. And then we have to talk about Sigmund Freud. Okay, his psychoanalytical theories were embraced by the elite in the 1920s. People thought, well, that's what Freud says. He interpreted Darwin into human behaviors. We're animals, so this is why we act how we act. This implies a godless worldview, right? There's no God, we're animals. And it contributed to the breakdown of traditional values. One of the lasting influences was his diagram of the human personality. And that's still used today, where you have the superego, the ego, and the id. The id is the deep down you, the ego is kind of your thought processes, and the superego is what you let other people see. The id, according to Freud, is the home of the instincts. It's your unconscious collection of things that determines what you're going to become, your surroundings and all of that, and what you accept. The id constantly demands gratification. And in this respect, it's a primitive function, or irrational. It just wants what it wants. The id doesn't know values. It doesn't know Christianity. It only knows what it wants and what it desires. It has no awareness of good or evil. And when the id is denied, the individual is frustrated and might even become neurotic, angry, and unhappy. Superimposed on the id is the ego, in which the id uses to interact with the outside world. So the ego helps him to be helps us to be more polite than we normally would be. It kind of covers for us. We all know how we really are on our best. For example, if we're at our grandma's house, and if we're at home with our parents, maybe we're not on our best. But this would be a little bit like that, that the id is the ego, and the id uses the ego to interact with the outside world. It puts its best foot forward when it needs to. So the ego would be what the world sees as the real person rather than the id. Everybody hides their id, their worst parts. Above both of these is the superego, something like a conscience, bringing guilt or approval, acting like a judge. Behind these lie a pair of instincts called the life instinct and the death instinct that are continually in conflict with one another. Now, I have referenced this essay. I think you can print it from the internet, 10 or maybe it's 20 pages, Civilization's Contents by Sigmund Freud. And I've talked about this before. And here's your first quote. Hence, we know of two sources for feelings of guilt, that arising from the dread of authority, and the later one from the dread of the superego. The first one compels us to renounce instinctual gratification because authority says that's wrong. Don't eat the cupcake. You want the last cupcake and your mother told you not to. So that compels you to not eat the cupcake for instinctual gratification. But the other presses over and above this toward punishment. Mother might spank you if you eat that last cupcake. Since the persistence of forbidden wishes can't be concealed from the superego, it still wants the second cupcake. It still wants to eat it. And which one's going to win? Libido is the great reality in Freudian psychology. Libido is the pleasure urge or instinct, the driving force behind all human action, according to Freud, that you simply want that cupcake. So pervasive, although usually he uses sexual intimacy as what the libido wants. It's not a cupcake. I like to use this in high school for reference. So pervasive is this concept that our dictionaries have even adopted Freudian thought to define many human actions. Look up libido and you see Freud is still alive, even though he's been discredited. Now, in a book called The Question of God, this is really a good book. C.S. Lewis and Sigmund Freud debate God, love, sex, and the meaning of life. And of course, they didn't even live at the same time. But using Dr. Armand Nicolai Jr. uses quotes from both of them and sets them up to argue it out, to have this debate, which is really cool. He tells us in his book, The Question of God, that for Freud, what people call happiness is the result of a sudden satisfaction of these sensual needs that have been bottled up. So Freud says happiness is when you get what you want. You just get everything that you want. Likewise, a failure to satisfy those needs can lead to unhappiness. For Freud, cultural restrictions that limited individuals' pursuit of sensual pleasure are repression, and they're to be opposed. So you really want the cupcake, and you fear your mom. If the cupcake's going to make you happy, you should just eat the cupcake. However, we as Christians know that there are reasons your mother says don't eat the cupcake. Maybe you've had too many cupcakes already. Maybe you're already quite rotund or fat, and your mother doesn't want you to eat that cupcake. And eating the cupcake will not make you happy, will it? As millions of fat Americans can tell you, eating what made them happy didn't really make them happy. It made them unhappy. And an hour later, they wish they hadn't have eaten it. So you kind of exclude all of these things. But the idea from Freud is that if you want something, you just need to go get it. Eat it, take it, do it, whatever it is that makes you feel happy. Because if you repress that and don't do it, excuse me, if you repress that and don't do it, it might even make you neurotic or something. C.S. Lewis, whose worldview Nicolai contrasts with Freud's, what he called suppression. Excuse me. Suppression, the conscious the conscious effort to control our desires and impulses. Now, is it good to suppress your desire for that last cupcake? Yes. You want to learn how to obey your mom. Your mom might have a reason. Maybe she knows you shouldn't have another cupcake. Maybe she wants you to be able to sleep tonight. Maybe somebody else is coming home, another sibling who hasn't had a cupcake. Maybe daddy's coming home. She's saving it doesn't matter what her reason is, but your mother has determined that that cupcake is not for you. And will you be happier actually as a Christian? As a little Christian, little kid, will you be happier if you eat that forbidden cupcake or if you don't? Of course, you'll be happier if you don't. You'll lay in bed that night and mommy will pray with you and ask God to bless you for obeying her. And you will feel so happy that you didn't eat the cupcake. You'll still kind of want the cupcake, but you'll be so glad you didn't eat it. So C.S. Lewis says we suppress our desires, not because they're necessarily bad, but because something more important is at stake. And that is a good thing. Remember, the Bible is the dividing line between civilization and chaos. That quote, I keep telling you, it seems for Freud that the price we pay for civilization is neurosis, civilization and its discontents, neurosis, or as Freud himself would express it, if the development, and you should have a cigar, if the development of civilization has such a far-reaching similarity to the development of the individual, and if it employs the same methods, may we not be justified in reaching the diagnosis that, under the influence of cultural urges, some civilizations or some epochs of civilization, possibly the whole of mankind, have become neurotic. Neuroses are extreme emotions or reactions, like, becoming hysteric, hypochondriac, obsessive, phobic, claustrophobic, agoraphobic, depressive, melancholic, kleptomaniac, or pyromaniac. So, it's what you go to see your counselor about, or your to be psychoanalyzed. Why do you hate your mother? Because of this or that. So neuroses, it's thought that that's why we have all these bad things, because we repress our urges. Expect to see these neurotic characters in literature. Remember Carl Tiflin? He's neurotic, right? Then we come to William Faulkner. Now, we don't get to read William Faulkner, but he was an American novelist, and he employed Freudian elements in pretty much everything he wrote, as did virtually all serious American fiction writers after World War I. And that would include Hemingway. These are people that just simply believe Darwin and Freud. To remain normal, man must not deny himself. Man is motivated by the id, which seeks pleasure. Can you imagine living your life to seek pleasure? Conscious is religious conditioning, which applies moral restraint, and that results in neurosis, or does it? Man is an animal enslaved by animalistic urges. Are you? Are you really enslaved by that? And does moral restraint make you neurotic, or is it good for you? Is moral restraint good or bad? And of course, we know as Christians, it's good. Writers now create characters based on the assumption that man is motivated and driven by his urge for pleasure. We even sell laundry soap that way, with some sexy bikini-clad lady in the laundry room. And that's how we sell cars, for certain, because fancy, expensive cars, a lot of those decisions are made by men, mostly men. And so we sell those with sexy women, scantily clad women, because the idea is that he wants to buy that car because then young women like that would be attracted to him. And so that's how we think people are motivated. And for some people, I think it works, hopefully not for Christians. Platonic influence in Freud, Socrates' motto on way back in class, if you took classical lit, Socrates' motto on the cave at Delphi was, one of the two was, know thyself, which meant use your reason, think, find answers. Above all, examine your life, because the unexamined life is not worth living. Now, know thyself didn't mean go find yourself. It really meant know that you're nothing. The gods could squish you at any moment. Think. And the unexamined life is not worth living. Platonic influence, definitely. But this was all about the Delphic oracle, and that's another class. As Christians, we proclaim not know yourself, but know Christ. That's the absolute opposite. Socrates said, In every one of us, there are two ruling and directing principles whose guidance we follow wherever they may lead. The one being an innate desire of pleasure, the other an acquired judgment which aspires after excellence. And of course, that word there, this is in his dialogue, the Phaedrus, which we read in classical lit. And that word excellence, just like in Philippians, I think it's 4:18, that says excellence, whatever is excellent, whatever is excellent, excellent, excellent. And that's that word arete. So that's classical lit, another story. But we can get the truth from the Apostle Paul in Romans 7. We know that the law is spiritual, but I'm unspiritual, says Paul, sold as a slave to sin. I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do. But what I hate, that's what I do. And if I do what I do not want to do, I agree that the law is good. As it is no longer I myself who do it, but it's sin living in me. I know that nothing good lives in me, that is, in my sinful nature. You see, theology always has all the answers. For I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. I do not want to eat the cupcake, but I do. For what I do is not the good I want to do. No, the evil I do not want to do. This I keep on doing, eating too many cupcakes. Now, if I do what I do not want to do, it is no longer I who do it, but it's sin living in me that does it. So I find this law at work. When I want to do good, evil is right there with me. For in my inner being, I delight in God's law. But I see another law at work in the members of my body, waging war against the law of my mind and making me a prisoner of the law of sin at work within my members. What a wretched man I am. Who will rescue me from this body of death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then, I myself in my mind am a slave to God's law, but in the sinful nature, a slave to the law of sin. Yeah, that should be highlighted in your Bible. Okay, what about Karl Marx? You hear about people talking about Marxism and Marxist and all that. Well, Karl Marx interpreted Darwin socially and economically. Communism and communistic economics say religion is the opiate used by the rich and powerful to enslave and control the poor. So the rich and the powerful don't believe in God, but that's how they enslave the poor. Send them all to church and let them pray for pie in the sky religion, better days after they die. Marxism became popular among American writers. Oh, wow. Big whoop, surprise, surprise. During the Depression years, so the 1930s, Marxism appealed to unions, but the power of the people, but disappointing since individuals lose their personal liberty and their property in the effort to achieve the classless society. And that's why if you hear politicians talking about taking people's 401ks and their inheritance so that when, for example, a person dies, instead of their children getting their inheritance, there are some lawmakers talking about you divide it in half. You let the children of the person who died have half the inheritance, and the other half goes to people who don't get an inheritance. And of course, the people who have an inheritance, many of them, like my husband and I, we've worked very, 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 very hard. But the idea is that Marxism says, no, you collect all the money and you pass it out to everybody. So they're talking right now in March of 2023. San Francisco doesn't know how they're going to do it, but they want to have a whole population of homeless. They want to give everybody $1,000 a month. And now Portland, Oregon has even proposed that. We want to give all the homeless people and all the poor people $1,000 a month of sure income. And of course, that's not going to go well. But the idea was you wouldn't have class. You wouldn't have low class and high class. You'd collect all the money and divide it between everybody, except the people in charge who keep most of the money. Friedrich Nietzsche, he interpreted Darwin philosophically, socially, and religiously. Remember, theological void, there's not going to be a God. Philosophy is, of course, arbitrary, and it reflects little more than the subjective side of the thinker, while Christianity provides absolutes based on eternal truths, reflecting God's character, truth that is true in all places, in all times, for all people. Christianity, Nietzsche said, is the priest class that convinces the herd, all the rest of us, that the afterlife is the only important thing. And some people call that pie in the sky religion. And Friedrich Nietzsche, this is from his Antichrist. I've got to have a few quotes for you this week from Nietzsche. Wherever there, and you have to say it angrily, wherever there are walls, I shall inscribe this eternal accusation against Christianity upon them. I can write in letters which make even the blind see. I call Christianity the one great curse, the one great intrinsic depravity, the one great instinct for revenge, for which no expedient is sufficiently poisonous, secret, subterranean, petty. I call it the one immortal blemish of mankind. The word Christianity is already a misunderstanding. In reality, there has been only one Christian, and he died on the cross. Whoa. Of actual religious difficulties. And now this is from Thus Spoke Zarathustra. This is the one that Nietzsche thought would replace the New Testament. Yes, he thought quite well of himself. Of actual religious difficulties, I have no experience. I have never known what it is to feel sinful. A prick of conscience, of which I have no experience, must be a sort of evil eye. And of course, now we would call that, if you don't have conscience, we would call you a psychopath or a sociopath. That's what we now call a person with no conscience. Must be a sort of evil eye. I am too inquisitive, too incredulous, too high-spirited to be satisfied with such a palpably clumsy solution of things. God is really no more than a coarse and rude prohibition of us thinkers. Ye shall not think. You like that? Okay, moving forward. What about modernism in literature? And of course, modernism equals anti-tradition. You have to know that. Modernism equals anti-tradition. Realism. Now, all literary periods have employed realism, but what's different about this kind of realism, modernism? It assumes the world is just controlled by blind fate and chance and not a providential hand. What secular writers call realistic, we as Christians will think very unrealistic. A Christian realism emphasizes the major theme of wisdom and the goodness of God and the purpose and order of the universe. A minor theme is the failure and the misery of rebellious man. But in realism, you write what you see. We see a plan, we see a purpose, and we see a hope. These men saw mankind as more beast than man, and they saw the futility of life's struggle. We saw miracles and they saw despair. It really all depends on your worldview. Naturalism, the cosmic chill, I love that phrase, the cosmic chill, the world is against you and trying to freeze you out. And if it's in Hemingway, freeze you literally. Similar to realism, but it actually employs Darwinism into that worldview, not just trying to show things as they really are, but to show that the world is against you and that nature is against you. They're not just trying to write what they see, they're writing characters like they're locked into fate, like the men in the boat or to build a fire. They're locked in. Life is controlled by forces that no one can change or even understand. And the point of view is completely detached. You see no pity there. The author will rarely let the character control his life. The thesis is that all of life is an illustration of the laws of evolution. The wars had shaken up the basic concept of man's continual progress. Remember, Romanticism was in reaction to theology. Theology said man is born in sin and he has to have rebirth so that he can get better, but that we are declining from Adam and Eve. And Romanticism said, no, we're getting better and better and better and better and better. And evolution says that we're getting better and better and better and better. But the wars shook up that idea of continual progress. And the wars made us think, well, maybe we are regressing. And so we see this pessimism and depression creeping into literature. At the same time as Nietzsche and Freud broke away from that Enlightenment tradition that said man was inherently good and getting better, artists, composers, writers rebelled against all the traditional forms of artistic, musical, and literary expression. Their work created a great cultural revolution that we call modernism. It's a major step in the revolution of the hierarchy conception. You couldn't ask for things to be more different. Modernism is characterized by the heightened awareness of the self, its intense introspection, its anti-tradition, which means anti-Christian. For the modernist artist, writer, the conscience had become a barrier to creativity and the expression of emotion. Modernism is defined as a movement, and this is from your glossary, a movement to reconcile developments of 19th and 20th century science and philosophy with historical Christianity. It arose from the application of modern critical methods to the study of the Bible and the history, and it stressed the humanistic aspects of religion. Its ideas permeated many Protestant churches and called forth a reaction in fundamentalism. The modernist artists abandoned all artistic traditions and literary conventions, and they began to experiment with new modes, new forms of expression. So they destroy history in order to create their own history. They don't feel compelled to reflect the image of God or his creation with harmony, logic, beauty, and order in writing or in art. The modern man, or even in building and architecture, the modern man would soon reflect little of God's attributes. And we see this descent of the modernist. I know this is in your syllabus, but I love this little cartoon. I think that it's worth a lot. The descent of the modernist. So you see Christianity, and first he decides that the Bible's not infallible. One step down. Well, maybe there's some mistakes in the Bible. And then he decides we're not made in man's image. Maybe we really are monkeys. And then we kind of exclude miracles. Well, those things can all be explained away, or they didn't really happen. And then all of a sudden there's no virgin birth and no deity, no atonement, no resurrection, agnosticism. We don't know what we believe. And then finally, and that's Freud at the bottom of the stairs, atheism. Nobody believes in God. And it all started with one big step. Meaning is no longer important in art or literature, only the form of the poetry or writing. So the concept of form, and that's odd, isn't it, for writing, but that it's the form is more equal or more important than the content. And that's the cornerstone of post-World War II art and literature. So you have this vision and viewpoint become essential as an aspect of the modernist novel of, well, no longer was it sufficient to write a straightforward third-person narrative, or worse yet, use a pointlessly intrusive narrator like Harriet Beecher Stowe. The way the story was told became the form of the story became more important or as important as the story itself. And that's where you have somebody like Henry James or William Faulkner. Many other American writers, they experimented with fictional points of view, and many are still doing so. James often restricted the information in his novel to just what a single character would have known. Faulkner's novel, The Sound and the Fury, not to be mixed up with the little 6.5 minute skit that you can go to session 28 and look and see The Sound and the Fury, the funny little skit, not based on William Faulkner at all. But that's in session 28, by the way, if you want to see that. The Sound and the Fury, the skit, 6.5 minutes by some TAs who presented it so that people can understand it. We used to read that play, go through that skit, but nobody understands it anymore. But I think the TAs do a really good job. But the real Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner breaks the narrative into 4 sections, and each gives a viewpoint of a different character, including one who's a mentally challenged boy. So you have the different forms. And we see that arising in the United States. It brings a new vocabulary, and new critics were hunting for their epiphany, right? That epiphany, which is the moment that the character suddenly sees the truth of the situation. Oh my goodness, I'm going to die. Something like that. It's a term derived from a holy saint's appearance to mortals, where they have an epiphany of what God wants them to do, but instead the epiphany of death. So modern art, modern literature, everything changes. They examined, they clarified a work, they hope to shed light through insights that offered an alternative to previous extra literary methods of criticism based on history and biography. So now these same people are looking at old books. And what we do in Lit Circle classes is we say, well, what did they write it for, and what did it mean? What did the author mean when he wrote it? And now we look at that and we say, well, what does it mean to us? And how can we look at it differently? How can we look through a modern lens at old books, which I think the writers would just have hissy fits over. New criticism became the dominant American critical approach, even in the 40s and 50s, because it proved to be well suited to modernist writers like T.S. Eliot. And it could utilize Freudian theory and Darwinian socialism, especially the categories of id, ego, and super ego. You would apply that. And that's why you'll have people talking about Shakespeare, and they think that the sexual urge is the main the main force behind every character in every Shakespeare play, which is absurd. Robert Lee Frost. Robert Frost, I hope you like him. He was born in California, but raised on a farm in northeastern United States until he was 10. Then he went to England, attracted by new movements in poetry there. He read an original work at the inauguration of President Kennedy in 1961 that helped spark a national interest in poetry. He actually wrote a poem for the inauguration, but it was new. And then he got there and the sunlight was so bright he couldn't read the poem. And so he recited one from memory, and that's a famous poem. His popularity is easy to explain. Why? Why do Christians love Robert Frost? Why is he America's poet, or he was? He wrote of the traditional farm life. He appealed to the nostalgia for the old ways. His subjects are universal: apple picking, stone walls, fences, country roads. His approach was clear and accessible. He rarely employed intellectual allusions, writing in Latin and Greek and things like that, things that people couldn't understand without research. Anybody could understand Robert Frost's poems. His frequent use of rhyme also appealed to the general audience because rhyme had pretty much been abandoned. This is Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening by Robert Frost. And I have highlighted in color the lines that rhyme. You can see the pattern here is A, A, B, A, B, B, C, B, C, C, D, C. It's a pattern. Whose woods, and there's alliteration here, whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake, and to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Then E.E. Cummings, you can tell by the lack of capitals that, of course, he's using form also, and he was a communist. Wrote innovative verse, distinguished for humor and experimentation with punctuation and visual format on the page. He was a painter turned poet, the first one to realize that even poetry was primarily visual now, not an oral art. And so he used unusual spacing, indentation, as well as dropping all use of capital letters. He said, if you like my poems, let them walk in the evening a little behind you. Then people will say, along this road I saw a princess pass on her way to meet her lover. It was toward nightfall with tall and ignorant servants. You know, what's that mean? I don't know. Hemingway wrote about war, hunting, and all these masculine things in this really crisp, plain style. It wore a lot of turtlenecks, used that detached descriptions of action with simple nouns and verbs to be precise. No Latin or Greek for Hemingway. And the characters often have no names. He believed in writing out of his own experiences. His writings and his personal life had a huge impact on other writers of his time. Some people they wanted so bad to be like Hemingway. Some stories have been made into movies, not very good ones. He was an ambulance driver in World War I, looking for action, severely wounded, spent time in Florida, Italy, Spain, Africa. So he traveled all over the place. And then I mentioned the Yukon. I was a news correspondent in World War II, injured again severely. He has still about 15 unpublished works. I just looked it up yesterday. Discovered after his death in 1961. There were a bunch more, but a bunch have been published. And they are in the JFK Presidential Library. New manuscripts, they're still finding new manuscripts from Hemingway. Modernism can be characterized by the heightened awareness of the self, right? It's all about me. Intense introspection. For the modernist artist or writer, intellect or conscience has become a barrier to creativity and the expression of human emotion. Human reason, especially that associated with Christian morality, traditional morality, rather than man's liberator, that's your captive. Hemingway, he says men and women are deprived by World War I of faith and moral values they once believed in. And now writers like Hemingway think we live in cynical disregard for all but our own emotional needs. So every man for himself, it's survival of the fittest. So we see simple characters with primitive emotions. And so Hemingway wrote about prize fighters and bullfighters, and they usually fight feudal battles against circumstances, but they do get to choose how they die with dignity. Other books by Hemingway, The Sun Also Rises, Morally Irresponsible People Living in Spain. This is the Thelma Digest. A Farewell to Arms. This is a love affair between an American officer driving an ambulance and a British nurse. Of course, he had that experience as with the ambulance. And For Whom the Bell Tolls, all about the Spanish Civil War. The Old Man on the Sea, an old Cuban fisherman. We had to read this one when I was in high school. Kind of boring, but it's okay. And then The Killers, you're reading that one this week. John Steinbeck, when I was your age, all we got to read was Steinbeck. He was really fresh and brand new, and we just read Steinbeck. Born in Salinas, California, educated at Stanford, worked as fruit picker and ranch hand. So he wrote about what he knew, writing about the dignity of what he sees in people who work for a living. And he wrote about the poor and the oppressed. His characters are often trapped in an unfair world or have irrational people in them. He also wrote of Mice and Men. That's that tragic story about George and Lenny. They're migrant workers who dream of a small fall of their own. And George kind of takes care of Lenny. Lenny has a really low IQ, what we call mental, no, they don't say mental retarded, they say mentally challenged today. But Lenny then accidentally kills somebody, and George is afraid they're not going to have their farm now. Lenny accidentally kills somebody, and they have to decide, oh my goodness, what are they going to do? Lenny's all worked up, and George knows he's going to be arrested, and people will do horrible things to him in revenge. And so George, there's a mercy killing there. He just kind of walks up behind him like, you're my good friend, and then whacks him. Grapes of Wrath, I told you about that one. If you want to know more about that one, read the last page, then decide if you really want to read it. Of course, we read the short stories, and we read the short poem, the Red Pony. And that's today's class. Sorry, I ran on for a little bit. There were a lot of slides this week. Okay, the Lord bless you, and I'll see you next week. Have fun with your assignment. I know you'll just love these encouraging, uplifting stories. Lord bless you.